Fire, 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 fire.
Hi, my name is Josh Garry. I'm a history teacher, and this is Way Back When with Blanguage. Chattel slavery and enslavement in Africa had a key difference, and for me, this key difference was around money. The Africans who were enslaved in the African continent, they were usually enslaved as a result of being captives or prisoners of war or for crimes or debts that they had. Whereas the transatlantic slave trade was purely a process that existed mainly for financial return. And it pretty much came about as a result of the discovery of the Americas, or the New World, should we say. The discovery of the New World presented a number of opportunities for Europeans, but it also presented problems. They found that products such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, especially sugar, grew in these areas, and there's a great demand for these products in Europe. The problem is these products were very, very labor intensive, so they needed people to cultivate the crops. There were Native Americans that they initially tried to use, but a number of Native Americans died as a result of the disease, and some of them successfully resisted. The problem was still in place for people to go to cultivate the crops. They did use indentured servants at a point, but indentured servants often served for fixed terms. They were often free, and notwithstanding the populations of Europe, they couldn't transport all the population of Europe to the Americas to produce these crops. So this brought them to Africa. Slavery had been going on in Africa for a long time, and the trading of enslaved people had been taking place between Europeans and Africans. The key thing was this started to increase, and Europeans started to fuel this, and where slavery was once a punishment or a consequence of a loss in war, it eventually became a motivation, and Europeans funded this, or shall we say fueled this, by providing kingdoms with guns, and warring kingdoms would go against each other. And the key thing for these kingdoms was they didn't necessarily see themselves as all black. They didn't see themselves as African. Somebody from the Kingdom of Congo had considerable cultural and language differences to someone from the Kingdom of Benin. In the same way, a German person wouldn't see themselves as English. There are differences in religion, there are differences in language, and there's differences in culture. And that's why the story of the transatlantic slave trade is very, very complicated. It wasn't Africans selling Africans because they didn't view themselves as African at that time. The first recorded Europeans we have would be the Portuguese, who came to the coast of West Africa. And they developed a relationship with the African kingdoms which stretched over a number of 100 years. What started to happen, however, is the Portuguese and the Spanish started to make vast sums of wealth from the transatlantic slave trade, which England became aware of. Now started to have the merge of what we call Britain today. James I of England and James VI of Scotland united the kingdoms of Scotland and England to start to form what we now have today as Great Britain. We know that during the Tudor period, slavery wasn't legal in England. However, things started to change. What you often had individuals or individual merchants who chose to get involved and try their best to make a profit from the transatlantic slave trade or through slavery. And at times you would have had support. For example, Elizabeth I, while she didn't support slavery, she did support Sir Francis Drake in privateering. Privateering basically meant that Sir Francis Drake had royal permission to plunder and rob from Spanish ships. However, Charles II was different, where instead of it being an individual adventure, it became something that was state-owned, state-sponsored. You know that initially it was very much something that was driven and motivated by those in the upper echelons of society. That's where it drove from. But the question is, how did they get people to buy into it? And that's where ideas about racism, ideas about Darwinism, and ideas about black people being inferior to white people really crystallized to legitimize what they were doing. You see, enslaving an African doesn't sit well with Christianity and Christian morals. So there was always an argument, how do you get around this? The first thing that started to happen is the concept of what we call black and white. For the first time, as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, Europeans started to refer to themselves as white, and they started to refer to people from Africa as black. That key difference was important for them to get people who are not necessarily in the ruling society to buy into this. You then started to have ideas such as Darwinism, and Darwinism was manipulated. As I stressed earlier, Darwin was never in support of slavery, and he very much argued against it. However, Darwinism was used to justify the transatlantic slave trade, the idea of survival of the fittest. And they used the idea of the Europeans being the fittest to enslave the Africans. And that's where, once again, race came in. We're all part of one race, the human race. Our biological makeups are those of the Homo sapiens, and we're very similar. However, how do you justify enslaving one human against another? You create race. And when you create race, you start to put into notion the idea that some races are superior to others. So first, we started to have ideas in terms of blackness and whiteness. We've seen the mutation of Darwin's theory. And finally, they started to talk about Christianity and the idea that Christianity, or spreading Christianity, is for the good of the wider world. And that's these complex ideas started to weave together, and slowly it started to become accepted by the general public. Britain's story is quite interesting. You didn't have plantations in England. Plantations were not in Britain. You tended to have plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas. But you did have enslaved people here. Sometimes plantation owners would bring their enslaved people over to Britain. In addition to this, it was a luxury to have black servants, and to have, especially in particular, boys during this period. So you often had a number of black boys in this period. And how do we know about this? We know about this through what we call the Human Cry Advertisements. And these were advertisements where enslaved people who ran away for freedom, there was often a reward to find these enslaved people. As time went on throughout the, Georgian period and the industrial period, people became more and more aware of slavery, because slavery was linked to the growth of this country, and especially when looking at cotton. The cotton that was picked in the fields in the deep south were brought over to Britain, and they were spun in northern cities such as Manchester. And the cotton yarn, for example, became a very, very popular thing. Now, the American Civil War happened, and there was a split, as opposed to, the northern states who wanted to abolish slavery and the southern states who wanted to keep it. You had cities like Liverpool, for example, who were strong supporters of the southern states and wanted to keep slavery because they were aware of the profits that it produced. But you also have exceptions, and there was a city known as the City of Rochdale, which was also in the north, who were very much against the transatlantic slave trade, and in fact wrote a letter to President Abraham Lincoln supporting what he was doing and saying that the troubles that we're going through in Rochdale is nothing in comparison to the enslaved Africans on the other side of the Atlantic. So I can't give you a for or against. What you have is a variety of opinions and a variety of responses, and what may not once have been known became much better known as time went on. So there's a perception that Africans were docile and they didn't fight back against the transatlantic slave trade. This could not be further from the case. Africans fought back against the transatlantic slave trade from the very moment of its inception, and they fought back through a variety of ways. You had the Obas in Benin who refused to engage in the transatlantic slave trade. You had Queen Nzinga from the Kingdom of Congo, who fought against the Portuguese involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. You had a variety of mutinies on ships where slaves actually literally fought against their captors, and in some cases, they freed themselves. But you also had other different forms of resistance. For example, you had people who lived in Africa stopped living so close to the coast and started moving further and further and further into the forest to flee slavery. And the cassava crop is a crop that hasn't got much nutritional value. But what it allowed the Africans to do, Africans could literally plant the crop, run away into the forest, the dense forest, and come back and pick it up at a time that was safe for them. And that is one of the key ways that they resisted slavery in Africa. But there are other forms of resistance. You actually had open rebellions. You had the Haitian Revolution. You had rebellions in Jamaica. You had the Maroons, for example, who fled the plantations and created whole new towns and villages for themselves. And then you also have examples, for example, in Brazil, where enslaved Africans resisted enslavement by holding on to their traditional names, holding on to their traditional practices. And in some areas in Brazil, you can actually find direct links between some of the deities and practices that they have and some of the practices that you'll find in the Yoruba land today. Now, this is not to say that slavery didn't have a long-term impact on enslaved Africans. The slave codes that were put in place in Barbados and some of the inhumane forms of torture, violence, bloodshed and rape, literally over the years beat the fight out of some of the enslaved Africans. However, it would be wrong to believe that Africans didn't fight from the very inception of the transatlantic slave trade, and it'd be wrong to assert that they were suddenly saved by white abolitionists. Africans were central to gaining their freedom, and they continued to fight right even up until the abolition. You got free work. Literally, not only did you get free work that you didn't need to pay for, you got a generation's worth of free work because an enslaved person's child automatically became a slave. You had a number of products that were in great demand in Europe. You had sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These were incredibly important in our industry, but to add to that, they provided jobs because the people who worked in the factories and used these could not work if they did not come from the Americas or the other plantations. You had the money that was from the transatlantic slave trade was used to build railroads, to fund insurance, and it actually built cities in England. Cities such as Liverpool, Bristol, and London were chief beneficiaries from the transatlantic slave trade. So you see, it's impossible to talk about the story and the history of Britain without talking about the story of the transatlantic slave trade. In the next session, we're going to look at colonialism and the contribution of Black people to development of British society.